So good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's landscape workshop. Nigel, are you there, bud?
I am indeed, Jay. I can't see the screen yet, but I'm sure it's going to come my way.
It's going to be coming your way shortly. I still have it at the moment. Thanks for coming back. Last week's feedback was phenomenal. They loved you. I love you anyway. You know that. But
Yeah, yeah, but not in the biblical sense.
Absolutely. But the presentation was great, and obviously we did talk about last week how tonight is a bit of a continuation from last week's presentation. Obviously, if you haven't seen last week's, it is available on the Photographer Academy. And again, I can send you a link to get access to that if you haven't, so just request that via support. Nigel, we do have some new people online with us tonight who haven't been with us before. So before we get going, just tell us a little bit, very quickly, about yourself, how you kind of got into the photography, and obviously a little bit about your training as well.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Yeah, good to speak to you all, and good to hopefully some of the people that were with us last week are back as well. Um, as Jay mentioned, I'm Nigel Forster. I've been a master photographer with the Academy for about 4 or 5 years now, something like that. I've been started doing photography in the early 1980s. Dropped it for a long time before taking it up again in 2009. So I've been working professionally for about 9 years. It's about my fourth or fifth career, actually. Based near Brecon, middle of the Brecon Beacons. It's a lovely place to be. It's also a very white place to be at the moment. Anyone who lives anywhere near here, you'll see how deep the snow is. Just about managed to dig my car out this afternoon, but I still haven't moved it for a couple of days. But it's a great place anyway. So if you don't know the Brecon Beacons, please come up here at some point. So yeah, I'm going to. Do you just want me to carry on, Jay? Are you going to
Yeah, I'm,
interject
no,
anymore?
I'm going to give you the screen. So let's make sure I
Okay.
do everything clearly. So it's going to come over to you now, Nigel. 2 seconds.
Yeah.
So you should be getting a prompt now. While we just get that up and
Yeah.
running for you guys, we do want you to interact with Nigel tonight. So please, if you have any questions for him about tonight's presentation or about landscape photography, please use the question panel to do so. And then obviously I'll feed those questions to Nigel where appropriate, or we always allow plenty of time at the end. Have you had the
And
prompt there,
Jay.
Nigel? I've sent it over.
Yep. Okay. Well, I've got show my screen here,
That's the one.
and I'm clicking it. Is that working?
There we go. I'm seeing it in full.
Sorted.
Yeah, got it in full screen, Nigel. It's all perfect, bud. So I'm going to go
Good. Good.
quiet. So any questions for Nigel, please pop them through the question panel. Nigel, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Jay. Okay, as Jay mentioned, this is a continuation from one I did last week. This one's very originally entitled Part 2. The fact that last week's wasn't entitled Part 1 is neither here nor there. But not to worry if you didn't catch last week's and perhaps want to catch it another time. It is fairly distinct from the first one as well. So, you know, the fact that you can actually see this one and see the second one afterwards. I'm also going to briefly summarize what we covered last week as well. So hopefully it'll be a relatively seamless continuation. It's divided effectively into 3 parts. The first part of which is designing your images. Now I touched on this last week. I'm going to go into quite a lot more detail. Now, one thing you'll find, I know it refers to outdoor photography, and Jay's referred to landscape photography in the brief that you had. But you'll actually see a lot of pictures here which have nothing to do with landscape photography. That's very deliberate because it's all about creating an image style. And I want to reinforce the fact that if you're designing images, don't worry too much about the subject matter. It's less about the subject matter, but the more you think about how you form and create your images. And hopefully I'll be, by the end of it, I'll make this very clear. Secondly, I'm going to talk about interpretation, how we interpret the landscape and how you can interpret that through imagery, both through creative idea and a little bit if we have time. Now I'll mention if we have time because it's quite a long presentation this. So if we have time, I will cover a little bit on image processing, but that will come very much right to the end. Could be I'll have to save it for another time, but we'll see how we get on. So, few messages which I left you with last week, those of you who were with me last week. My key points on effective composition: simplicity, being very selective, on what you include and what you exclude from the image. Comes down to a fundamental question. If anyone can remember what the question that I asked you to ask yourselves last week, why am I taking this picture? It's behind everything else that you do. If you don't ask that question at the outset, then the likelihood the image won't succeed. And if the answer is, I'm not quite sure, it probably won't succeed either. So be very clear on why you're taking it, and use composition to convey that to your viewer. So there's a few bullet points there, and I want to focus today, whereas last week I focused perhaps more on the first three. The one I want to focus on today is more about the bottom one, the fourth one, individuality. How you can create, really hard to create unique images now, but create images in your own style, and perhaps seek to gain images that nobody else has taken. And it's really important to think on that, about the shapes and forms rather than the subject. It's about, and the first point, shooting for design rather than location. Don't worry about where you're going to. Go out with your camera and explore. Explore with your mind and explore with your camera, and it opens up all sorts of creative possibilities. So what I'm going to do is to go through a series of ideas with you. Now, not quite the next slide, but the one after. Thinking in abstract design. So this is very much about thinking about, I mentioned a lot about this last week as well, form, texture, color, shape, simple forms in composition. Now, the next slide you might find quite interesting. You'll see that my drawing skills are probably not as good as my photography skills, but there's a reason behind these images. Very simple image construction. As you can tell, it was done freehand. It wasn't done on a computer. Couldn't work out how to do that in Photoshop. The Nord represents something like a subject, and it's different ways you can represent the subject, the flow through the picture, the lines, the forms, the shapes of your subject. Now, at the moment, these might make not much sense. However, hopefully, when I go through some of these examples, you'll see there's some logic behind these. I've come up with a few here. I could come up with a lot more. In fact, I've got another one like this. I could doodle all night, actually. But about 10 slides time, I'll go through a few more of these as well. So you'll hopefully see that these start to make sense, that if you look at some of the images I've created, then these kind of tie in with what I'm showing you here. So, for the sake of a little bit of positive reinforcement, I'm just going to repeat a slide I showed you last week. I've added a couple of things to it, but fundamentally, it's one of the ideas I've got, and I'm going to go through a series of these. It's about thinking of images purely in terms of shape and form. You'll see that the three red and grey coloured images are effectively formed of two rectangles. And I've used a variation on that with the one with the seed rape field and the grey sky, just to reinforce the fact that it's the image form. You'll see a little doodle on the left-hand side as well, which shows effectively how that image is constructed. Two rectangles with a line, with the horizon line, and key points on that horizon line. So that's effectively what that image is about. Those of you who were with me last week will remember I had a whole series of these, which showed there were a series in color and a series in black and white, showing how I use that particular example, particularly when you want to give emphasis to the sky. And you can see the relationship between the foreground and the background in the image in the top right, which is actually a concrete wall and a piece of wood. Very similar image design. So I want you to start thinking in that sort of way. So following on from that, if you can relate, remember, to the little graphic there of the four lines and the two rectangles, look particularly at the image at the bottom. You'll see it happens to be a series of people working in a meadow. a fantastic looking wildflower meadow. If you've ever been to Stackpole, by the way, in Pembrokeshire, go. It's a really interesting place. It's run by volunteers, and all with learning disabilities, but it's they sell their plants as well. It's a really good place to go. But you can see I've used exactly the same image style with that. Look at the yellow field and the sky, as I have with the 3 people working in the field. Exactly the same compositional idea with foreground, the people in this case on the horizon line, and a backdrop. The backdrop's got a wall in the middle. Unfortunately, the wall was there. I wish it was simpler. Ideally, I would like that wall to be much simpler, but it's not. So you can see I've used the same kind of idea for a very different subject. And the next slide is a series of circles or curves. You're 10 out of 10 for anyone who can recognize what all these are. The top left is actually the rear light cluster of my own car. But there's a dustbin lid, there's a shop sign, there's something on a door, I think. Doesn't matter what they are. They're curves, they're circular, they're shapes, they're forms. As I mentioned last week rather, one of the things I go through with people who do my workshops is thinking of a theme. This happens to be curves or circles, and taking 10 pictures which comply with that theme. But I want to relate that now to a different kind of subject. So if you bear those shapes in mind, you could easily come up with 10 or 20 of those probably in half an hour in a place with quite a lot of material. It's an observational exercise. If you have a look at the next series of pictures, this one dominated by circles. It's comprised of very strong, simple images with circle as the theme, in a very similar way to this. So the next set are a series of curves. So these are all based on curves. Now you can see that I've got a series of images here, one of which is one of my favorite sheet pictures I use quite a lot. The picture of the wheel, the picture of the road, the Cardiff Millennium, it's Millennium Centre, isn't it? And an example of an image I took for a client, the one with the curved structure. So you can see you're using the same kind of imagery style with these sort of pictures as I did with the initial set of pictures there. Again, here, if you look at the 5 pictures here, subject matter is very different. Picture of the road, the picture of the path, the paving or the car trails, and the one taken of the clock. It's actually the clock tower at Ebbw Vale, by the way. But you can see in terms of image style, it's almost exactly the same as in reverse as the picture of the car headlight going off into the mist. So I'm using the same idea of a curve, and if we relate that back to these images here, which are simply observational. But what these do, if you do this exercise, what these do is encourage you to look for simplicity of form in everyday subjects. And if you train your eye to think in simplicity of form, then it will help develop your eye in terms of looking for composition when you come to photograph subjects that you're interested in. I'm going to go through one or two more of these themes as well, just to show you the relationship between the simple observational exercise, which is this, and real life photography, things you might actually do in your landscape photography or whatever your preference in terms of subject matter. So if we go on to the next one, another series of patterns. These were all taken in Morocco, actually. Just went around Casablanca, I think. Marrakesh, that's it. And just looked at a series of patterns. It's wonderful colors they've got there. So whether it's towels or the colouring on the peeling paint on the wall, but the patterns were so interesting and so vibrant, and they were ready made for that kind of observation. So I spent a while just exploring Marrakesh and came up with these. And again, like the one with the circles and the curves, it's a simple observational exercise. That's all it is. These kind of pictures are quite easy to take, but they are they are reliant on being very clear what you're including in the image and what you're excluding, and how to precisely frame the image. Maybe the one in the middle at the top actually would have been slightly better if I'd zoomed in a little bit more, cropped a little bit more, and perhaps taken that drain pipe out on the right hand side. So that's one maybe that would have been a little bit neater if I'd done that. But if I can then relate that to the next set of pictures, so these are a more diverse range of images, but they are, like the previous pictures, dependent on very simple repeating patterns and very simple shapes. So I've got a variety of pictures from architectural shots, a pattern in the sand, a line of trees, a reflection in the water, and anyone guess what that one in the middle on the left-hand side is? It's the stacked chairs, actually. By the way, I put that on Instagram, and I had a reply from the folding chair company who said, "You must be really interested in chairs, in plastic chairs. Please follow us." I didn't. You can see these are related to very much about repeating pattern, simple shape and form. If I go to the next series, they're similar again, but in a slightly different way. So these are much more flowing, but it's again simple repeating pattern. Can you see the connection between these two images? One's an estuary taken at Llanstefan, not far from where Dylan Thomas was born, and the field which was just outside, it was in mid-Wales. But the flow and the style of the imagery is exactly the same. So it's thinking about how those series of forms and shapes interlock to create that style. The only thing that differentiates these two pictures is effectively the color and the content. In other words, one's vegetation and trees, so it's quite detailed, and one's broadly a series of tones of different shades of red and brown. But fundamentally, the idea is the same. I've actually cropped that top one on the next set of pictures, so you can see which I've reduced to a square format. Works in a similar way, but this actually complements another series of pictures I've got, which use this same idea of flowing lines and flowing forms. So it's the one thing that characterizes all these pictures. They're all telephotos. And one thing that telephoto pictures do, these are all telephotos as well. A telephoto lens is very, very good for extracting simple shape and form of what can be a quite complex environment. So I don't think any of these, no, they're all telephotos, yeah. They compress perspective. So you end up with a foreshortening or very much a flattening effect, and very two-dimensional. So that's a real strength of a telephoto lens, and they're probably underused, hugely underused, particularly in landscape photography, because they can be really effective at compressing perspective in exactly the way that these have been done in all these examples. So try and get away from that landscape photographer's habit of always reaching for the wide angle lens. Another few examples here. So you can see I've again picked up another of my my scribbly graphics, but you can see the way the scribbly graphics relate to each of these examples. One subject all happens to be on the right hand side, doesn't need to be on the right hand side at all, could be anywhere, but interestingly they're all halfway up the image. So convention says put them on the thirds, but actually I think in terms of compositional balance, I prefer them actually about halfway up. But effectively, the idea of these images is a kind of banding effect, either through vegetation, either through the colouring in the sky reflected in the water, or in the case of the example on the top right, it's through a long exposure. The long exposure photography will do that if you got the wind going from left to right. Now, I think I've mentioned about long exposure before, mentioned about wind direction being fundamental to it, whether it's going towards or away from you or left to right. But that example is very good. If you have a left to right movement with sky and water, you get this nice effect where it's going from one side to the other. Something to think about if you want this style of imagery. The next one I'm going to go to is diagonals. Anybody who saw my presentation last week will see that I use diagonals a lot. Haven't got a set of simple graphic images on diagonals. Actually, I must go and I have actually got them, but I didn't put them on here. I've got a couple of examples at the bottom. Main reason I've chosen these is they're not really landscape photographs. They were all taken for clients. One was at a wedding, one was for the Landscape Institute. The one on the bottom right was showing the detail of some edging against planting. So they were all taken for different purposes. They were taken commercially, so just shows the diversity of way you can use a similar compositional style to create a series of effects. So on a diagonal theme, then it's something I thought I pursue quite a lot, both in my professional and my personal work. So if you look at, you probably recognize a couple of these from last week. I've tried to have a bit of a crossover between last week's images and these ones, partly because it helps with continuity, but partly they actually explain quite a lot of different things. The one on the viaduct, for example, and the one taken from the bottom of the bridge, which happens to be the Iron Bridge. In Iron Bridge, by Thomas Telford. So they are compositionally very, very similar. So the diagonal there is the strength of those images. Taking that theme on a stage further, you can see again a series of images where the diagonal in these is very, very strong, both a series of commercial images and a series of my own architectural images. So it's quite a, I find using diagonals is a very effective in architectural photography. Unlike the others, these are mainly taken with a wide angle lens, because wide angle lenses have got strength of perspective. They create that sense of drama from front to back of the image. So they have a very, very different and very opposite effect. In fact, I think these are all, yeah, they're all wide angles. Can I see any which weren't? The two at the bottom, they are telephotos. They're detailed to illustrate using diagonals, but in practice, most of these are using wide-angle lenses because they create that strong perspective from front to back of the image. I'm going to go on to Jay. Hang on, let's see whether it's a natural break moment or whether I can. Now I'm going to carry on for a bit. I'll carry on with about 5 more slides and I'll have a break in a minute. So, right, next one. You can recognize one of my little scribbles here, meandering lines. Now, those of you who were with me last week will also hopefully remember that I used this as one of my examples of lead-in lines. But actually, they are a lead-in line, of course, in the fact that they take your eye through the image, but they're also a strong visual element as well. And actually, they form conventional way of a lead-in line says that you're using a lead-in line to take the eye through the picture to a main subject. But actually, the way I tend to use lead-in lines is the main subject in itself. It is the picture in itself. So it becomes the dominant part. And the picture with the car in it on the bottom left-hand side is simply the way I used chap with the Ferrari. I know we wanted me to take a picture of his car, chose a winding section of road, and he went up and down the winding section of road. So you can use a similar idea as with all kinds of photography. The next one, again, you'll recognize some of these. Strong perspective. Let me just see, actually. Yeah, looking at the wide angle telephoto, interestingly enough, these are a mix of wide and tele shots. The one in the middle is, the top in the middle is a telephoto shot. The two at the bottom are telephoto shots. The top left and top right are wide angles. So you can create a similar kind of effect using different focal lengths. These ones, perspective. You probably remember I touched on this last week. So image composition is exactly the same. You've got strong perspective lines leading to a single point. hence the little graphic at the bottom. Whether it's an urban square, whether it's the woman planing a piece of wood, whether it's the shot at Penarth Pier, or indeed the shot of the wedding dress, all are using exactly the same principle, the same idea, taking your eye to a single subject. Possibly the weak one in this is in some ways the one at the top, where there is a main subject there. It isn't particularly distinctive. The lead-in lines are strong. In that respect, it's quite a strong landscape image, but the subject of the background possibly isn't as strong as some of the others. But the idea is there. You can see the effect that the effect that it creates. More on that theme. So with each of these, using perspective lines to take the eye into the picture with landscape or urban photography, using the same idea and the same principles to achieve a very similar effect. If I go to the next one, these are similar, but they don't use lines. Well, I forgot to do a little graphic thing showing a series of dots or a series of features. So I've ended up using the same one, using the lines leading to a point. But actually, these are a series of, whether it's a pattern on a designed wall, a paving pattern, a grass, or the pattern in the sand, then you've got effectively a pattern or a fragmented foreground, which takes the eye to the distance. The principle's the same, but it uses the same a texture instead of lines to take the eye to the background. So hopefully you can see there's a similarity in style. And again, I've used a combination of commercial work with landscape work. So those of you who are perhaps thinking about developing a style, or thinking about how you might develop a style in your commercial photography, think about how you can use these kind of ideas. You might want to develop a whole load of your own, which I haven't even thought of, but that you can apply both in your personal work and your professional work. One more on this before I'm going to break. Yeah. Next one. Plenty of these, as you can see. So I put a picture of a fan there because I didn't have a graphic picture of it, but fans seem to do the job. Compositional style effectively is a radial shape or a fan leading from a point at the bottom and taking the eye upwards. So the two at the top are very directly related to the shot of the fan at the bottom. The one on the top right is another long exposure shot. You can see the effect on the sky, this time with the clouds coming towards or away from me. The one at the bottom is not quite correct because it's more off center. Technically, I wanted that sun to be in the middle, but actually it changed the weight of the picture because I wanted, it's actually St David's Head in Pembrokeshire, that was quite a positive landform, and it meant there was quite an empty expanse of sea on the right-hand side if I put that in the center. So I placed it slightly off center. Whether that works or not, I'm not sure. I'm not so sure. But the principle's the same. And unlike these, which radiate from the bottom, this is a bit of a repetition of one I showed yesterday. These more radiate out from the middle. So the center of these images is much more critical than the previous ones, where the weight of the picture on these, because the main subject is at the bottom radiating upwards, therefore it's low down in the picture. With these, the center of the picture is really important because the whole image radiates out from the center. So this is more of a star shape. Effectively, you're radiating the center of the image, everything radiates out from that. So if I'm just going to close this section by a few more scribbly graphics. Hopefully some of those make sense. If you can see, I could come up with a lot more, but a few ideas in terms of image style that you can actually think about. The top middle, for example, I haven't got any examples of it. It's a reflection, a mirror image reflection, which might be, you know, if you've got a beautiful scene in a still water, something like that, a perfect mirror image reflection. That's what that one is. The one on the top right, strong diagonal, perhaps with If you remember, go back to the architectural shots I showed you a few slides back. It's a little bit too far back for me to go back, actually. But they were, in fact, I will, because it does relate to it. If you excuse me, hopefully I'll be able to do this. So if you remember that one on the top right, I'm going to have to go back a bit here. Where were they? Yeah, those there. Can you see the similarity between those images there, the two architectural shots, and in fact the one with the chairs, and the computer's keeping up, hopefully. Here we go. And the shot on the top right. And can you see the one on the bottom right, very closely linked to the architectural shot, the diagonal shots I showed you, particularly the ones with the bridges. So these are very much kind of, they're scribbles, but they're ideas, and you can create a whole load of these ideas, and you can actually form a series of images around them. Okay, that one's a bit out of place. I'm going to skip that one. I showed it to you last week anyway. It's rule of thirds. Jay, any questions at that point?
We've got a handful at the moment. A lot of them you've answered as you've gone. So as usual, I'm always paying attention. So where you've answered them, I've just quickly sort of got them out. But to be honest, we always get asked this question, and obviously I know you touched on it last week, but obviously we've got some new people online with us tonight. What's your preferred wide-angle lens, or what type of wide-angle lens do you use, Nigel?
I've got a 16 to 35 millimeter. Tend to use a zoom because I find them more flexible than a fixed focal length. Yeah, 16-35 and a full frame. So if you've got a crop frame, it's equivalent to about 9 to what is it? 9 to 19 or 9 to 18 or something like that. So yeah, that's my widest angle. I tend to use it wide quite a lot. In the opposite way, I tend to use my telephoto at the extreme quite a lot because I like that extreme one way or the other, strong compression or strong perspective.
Perfect. Again, I think we mentioned this last week, but we haven't talked about filters and stuff today. Your preferred method, using neutral density grads or using Photoshop and Lightroom to create the effect?
Ooh, right, that's a long answer. Yeah, slightly off subject actually. Yeah, okay. Right, well, you cannot replicate, if you're shooting against the light, you cannot replicate using the grads in Photoshop or Lightroom, because once you've lost detail, you can't get it back. So if you're shooting against the light, particularly when you haven't got where you've got strong light source with a perhaps very dark foreground, then you have to balance exposure in camera. If you try and do it afterwards when you've got extremes, you won't recover the detail. There's no use using the gradient filter in Lightroom or Photoshop, because by then you've already lost the detail.
Brilliant. I'm going to hang on to the others because, again, I think they are, well, we will answer them obviously, but they're not really on topic. The only reason I'm going to ask this one is because of the image that you've got in front of me, but it came on quite early when you were talking about being snowed in. Best advice for actually photographing snow? Well, there you go. That's the question.
Oh, best advice for photographing snow?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, wear a decent pair of walking boots.
I think the question's more with regards to exposure, really.
Yeah, I know. I did realise that, Jay. Okay. I mean, the main thing to remember, if you want to get it as close as you can in camera, the camera will always read grey. So snow is white. So cameras will habitually underexpose snow by about 2 stops. So if you give the exposure about 2 stops more when photographing snow, then you should render it approximately the right tone, the way you can see it with the naked eye. But always check your exposure by looking at the histogram and the highlights on the back of the camera to make sure that you've got sufficient shadow detail and you've maintained highlight detail before being happy with your shot. So don't rely on just seeing the image on the back of the camera. But generally, yeah, you should give it more exposure than the camera requires on snow. In snow as well, you might not need a graduated filter because there's much more of an equivalent balance of tones between sky and land on with snow because it's very reflective. So you probably won't need a graduated filter. Although I was shooting against the light with that one you can see in front of you there, I didn't use a graduated filter for that. Didn't need it because the sky was about the same tone as the light reflection in the sun. Other thing as well, a few other things. Snow can, particularly towards the middle of the day, produce very blue shadows, extremely blue shadows. So they will probably need pulling back in post processing.
Perfect, thank you, mate. I'm going to hang on to the other questions. We will ask you them. As you said, they're slightly off topic and more about sort of landscape photography in general. So I'll hang on to those and we'll answer those at the end. So it's back to you, mate.
Okay. Right. Okay. These are a little bit more. So hopefully that's given you an idea, a bit of a thought as to the way you can translate abstract idea and a few simple images where you're using everyday subjects to, as I mentioned, using whether it's curves, whether it's circles, whether it's squares, whether it's diagonals or whatever. The way you can actually translate and reflect that into real life photography. So what I'm going to go on to now is a little bit more of a cross section of creative ideas that you might want to look for to develop for yourself. So I'll move on to those. So these are obviously very high contrast images. Generally backlit. I'm going to come back onto the one in the middle on the bottom in a moment, in a few minutes when I've got time. Yeah, very bright, very dark, very high contrast images, very simple, and this kind of style of photography lends itself very well to simple compositions because it reduces what you see in front of you to simple, dark, and light. So your forms have to be very strong for this to work. If you've got a complex image and a complex set of light and darks, generally it doesn't work. So try and be very clear. Comes back to the question I asked right at the outset, why am I taking this picture? Now, the highlights form quite a strong form against the shadows with all these pictures. Whether it's the line of rain on the wet road, whether it's the squiggle of the stream leading into the reservoir, whether it's the highlight of the arrow on the one on the bottom right, I was very clear on each of these what was my main reason for taking the picture, and I used this idea to bring those out. Wet surfaces, pretty essential because they're reflective, and backlighting, essential because you get massively more contrast. This idea generally won't work if you're shooting with a light source behind you. Don't necessarily think, by the way, that the sun needs to be out. The sun generally wasn't out with these pictures, but even if the light source, i.e. the sun, is in the half of the sky you're shooting towards, you should get this effect. This one, figures in the landscape. Think about how you use scale. There's just a few examples here of shots where I've just got isolated figures in the landscape, and just something that adds an impression, idea of scale to an image. These ones I mentioned about long exposure shots earlier on. These work quite well together because they are very minimalist, very few simple shapes. I should point out the one of the bridge in the top left is not my shot. It's taken by a colleague of mine, John Farnan, who does an awful lot of long exposure photography. I haven't actually got one as like that, and it complements the ones I've got quite well. But the others are mine. That one is not, and you probably would have think that's actually the best shot on the forward. It probably is, which is why I'm using it. But you can see the way that just the structures of the long exposure has smoothed out the sky and the water and just isolated and picked out the simplicity and form of the structures in the image. And with all these, the wind was going from left to right across the image. Now, I don't know, a number of you may have seen my talk, my webinar on long exposure, I showed a number of examples. In fact, I've got a couple here where the sky's been going towards, I'm actually following it. I'm going to shut up there because following it, didn't realize I got the slide on following it. A series of images where I've got the sky going towards or away from the camera has a very different effect. So rather than a very smooth, very calming, tranquil effect, which these have got, very minimalist, very static, pick out a main subject very clearly. These have a completely different effect because the sky movement, the wind movement effectively coming towards or away from me creates this impression of the sky. It's very good for bold, simple compositions where you've got a very clear main subject. And I would usually, in most of these examples, put the main subject right in the middle of the frame because everything radiates out from it. I talked a minute ago about using radial compositions. Long exposures with the wind going towards or away from you are very good for radial compositions because they create that movement and they make the center of the frame extremely important because everything emanates from it. So instantly you're effectively calling for the main subject to be put in the middle of the frame. Those of you who are used to using the rule of thirds, yes, fine, apply it, but only apply it when it suits your composition. Goes back to the fundamental question that I've repeated on a number of occasions. Why am I taking this picture? If you're taking this, the picture to maximize impact on the main subject, put your main subject right in the middle of the frame because that's what your eye is drawn towards. Next one. Again, I've mixed a couple of images taken on commissions, one with an exhibition stand and one with a building, with 3 of my own personal shots. Used a very similar idea where effectively using a panoramic with a wide angle lens has stretched and emphasized the foreground and formed a strong part of the composition. So you can see that if you look at the 3 examples, one taken in the Elan Valley, one at Tenby, anyone recognize North Beach in Tenby, knows it isn't that shape, and the one taken in Clywedog and Mid Wales. The natural curve in the foreground has been hugely exaggerated by using a wide angle panoramic. So you can actually use this effect, which can be a really negative effect, by the way, because it can distort imagery hugely. You can use, if you've got a natural curve that you can work with, you can use this to quite creative effect. What it will do is it effectively emphasizes the curve by stretching out the foreground and keeping the background roughly in proportion. So you can use it positively. Do check if you're taking this style of image beforehand, give it a shoot in portrait format because you need maximum depth from top to bottom. You need your widest angle lens and pan across beforehand to check that your foreground feature constantly stays within the frame. If you drop the foreground out of the middle of the frame, it just doesn't look very good. So think of it as an integral composition, not that you're shooting a panoramic, but you're actually creating a strong compositional feature out of it. Couple more examples here. These are just examples using a very same idea with all 4 shots, different subject matter using backlighting. And each of them, I've used the sun as a single point. Using a small aperture will create this effect in the sun. Those of you Canons will do this an awful lot better job than I will do. I don't use Canon. It's one of the perhaps I wish I did because I actually quite like the effect. So those of you who do would certainly be much better at, particularly at night photography, where you get this really nice street light effect. But you can see image style very, very similar. They're backlit, using the sun as a key point, and the backlighting effect's really strong and interesting as well. Compositionally, the one on the top left with the snowscape, that wasn't taken today, by the way, it was taken last time with heavy snow, and the one taken in the bluebells, very, very similar, very, very similar composition. Next one, told you this is a random collection, light painting. Try and pick out a single subject, a single part of the composition. The one on the bottom left is obviously my car, which I walk around with a torch, but obviously also put the interior light on as well. Just lit a key subject, a key part of the image with a torch. The one at Glencoe obviously under the night sky there, you can see there. Probably would have been helped hugely if it had been like the weather is now. There wasn't any snow. That was taken last month, actually. There wasn't any snow at all. But that would have obviously added it's turned the mountain effectively, Baccalities Moor, into a little bit of a dark lump where a bit of snow on it would have balanced the composition. But I lit the waterfall in the foreground with a head torch. You don't need much light, by the way. It's really easy to overdo the lighting when you're using torchlight. You don't need very much. Any questions at that stage, Jay? I'm going to whiz through the last bit quite quickly, so there's time for questions.
The last slide, Nigel, if you can just jump back one for me. It just popped in, and I'm sure it is the ruin at the top in the top left. Is that you in the frame with that small speck of light? Is that the head torch?
That was actually no. It's one of my students.
Oh, I see. But that's the point of the torchlight.
Yes.
That's my
yes. That was it.
I
Correct.
thought it was, but that's what I was wanting to ask the question. But it popped up in the question panel at the same time. So
so there's an element of contradiction in that image actually, because it's shot into the moon. Now you would expect the moonlight to light the building from that side, so you're actually looking into the moon. So it's a slightly contradictory, the fact that it's got the moon into it. Maybe it's a stronger shot without the moonlight, not sure, but the moonlight is lighting up the foreground. So that foreground detail you can see is caused by the fact there's moonlight. So, but it does contradict itself in a way, because you've got the torchlight lighting it from the other side.
Brilliant.
It's an idea, nothing more.
No, the other questions that I've got for you, to be honest, Nigel, they're sort of more generic, so I'll still hang on to them.
Fine.
So you crack on with it.
Yeah, I'm going to. It's 10 to 8. I'm aware that time's running short, so I'm just going to whiz through the last bit quite quickly. It's connected, and it's to do with how you form your images. You'll see a lot of them repeated from the ones I've just shown you, but it'll give you an idea as to the way in which we can visualize, and the style of landscape that we can think about capturing in imagery. Pictorial, straightforward, simple, good on a picture postcard, often taken on a nice day. If you're selling pictures, fine. These sell because a lot of people who buy pictures effectively want a picture that evoke a memory of where they've been to. So little more than that. Very pictorial. Yeah, it's good for picture postcards. This one adds a touch of mood and drama. So these are still very familiar landscapes, familiar places. Tenby, Penavan, Glencoe, Tynebridge. All these are known places, but they're photographed with evocative lighting, which does lift them out and perhaps out from the ordinary. Again, if you're selling pictures with a commercial eye in mind, these will also sell probably more than the others, because these stand out a little bit more. Anyone can take these. There's lots of them around, but these perhaps stand out a little bit more. These ones a bit more, you'll recognize a few of these from the ones I've just shown you. These are a bit more individual. These are probably, both these and these, other people have got similar pictures, but try and find and capture what appeals to you. Now, these are just vignettes, part of a landscape, whether it's a head of barley, whether it's a rhododendron bush, or a snow on a tree, or a wheel, or an isolated tree, or something like that. Just something that appeals to you. So these are much more personal than they're vignettes and part of a landscape, rather than the grand vistas I showed you a minute ago. These are quite personal to me. I quite like these pictures. These ones, these have got more of a sense of place. They belong to a landscape. They are, for those who know an area, probably quite familiar, and they do capture the landscape, but they're taken from a much more photographic point of view than the first set, which were quite pictorial, because they are about the way the light catches the landscape. They were about the mood in the clouds. They're about the sun coming up and the texture in the foreground. They've got more to them in photographic terms than the first set of pictures I showed to you. And finally, it comes to what I've really been talking about for the whole of this presentation. It's about the much more abstract, graphic, simple composition which I try and promote. So whether it's capturing a moment, and I like these kind of pictures as well, because unlike the kind of pictures where people go to get to a great viewpoint to take a picture from, and I mentioned about these before and trying to avoid them, but these are unique to me, and I think it's much more valuable to try and capture pictures which are unique to you, which is why I like these sort of pictures as well, because they're very much unique to me, but very difficult for anyone to replicate them. And you can see they're much more simple in form, shape, color, and in execution than these ones, which are all very well, but populist. So thought I'd show a comparison, in fact, the one with the line of trees, which is in fact one of my favorite shots, between now, it was taken in 2009 actually. I tried to retake it last year. I couldn't. The light was perfect, but the trees had grown. Not only the trees themselves, but also the trees at the back. So they effectively stopped the light. So when the light went down and was lower, you can see it was quite low in the top picture. Effectively, we went behind the trees, I couldn't take the shot. So the landscape evolves. Don't forget, it's not only the seasons, it's not only the time of day, it's not only the weather, it's also the landscape changes as well. Finally, I did manage to, I've left a couple of minutes for this, interpretation through processing. So I've got a couple of ideas on this that you might want to think about, and I'm not going to spend any time on it at all because we're going to run out of time. So imitation, that's take a picture of Algol. That's the unprocessed raw file. So it shows you with a bit of, just the way we can lift from one to the other by a few simple tweaks. You'll also notice, by the way, that some things in the water, they're buoys actually, photoshopped out as well. So next one of my favorite shots, just shows you, in fact, I probably should have put the final shot first actually. Never mind, I'll move on. Different ways you can think about the tone. These are all subtly different, from high key to low key, to very subtly colored to very strongly colored, light to dark. No wrong or right about it. What did I see with the naked eye? I'm not actually sure. Probably something similar, possibly to the one in the middle top, but I can't quite remember. But how we interpret this photography through photography is entirely your choice. So you can go for the very literal approach. You can go for the very subtle approach. We can subdue everything, make everything very light and very soft, or you can make it very bold and very harsh. You can give your picture any mood you like. So in fact, these are cropped of the original. If I show you the original, it's a landscape format. The one on the bottom left is the original raw file, actually looking quite dark and dull and dingy, actually. So the other ones are from a different style of processing, from very muted tones, very somber tones, to perhaps quite almost a garish sort of warm tone. I think probably the one I prefer the most is probably the one on the top right. I've also vignetted the top and bottom of the frame in some of those as well. You can see on these, one on the top left, I've not. So vignetting, of course, encloses the image, but maybe if you want a simple composition, you're better off not doing it. But that is entirely your choice. How you process your images is entirely up to you. Don't forget, by the way, the raw file is the raw file. It does look dull and dingy. It doesn't look great, but that's how that's how it can come out of the camera. When you're processing at a JPEG, then the camera's already done the processing. So do remember that the raw file is not supposed to be how your final picture will look. This one's quite interesting. Because if you recall that picture I showed you before with my black and white high contrast examples, with the stream flowing into the reservoir, taken at Talabont Reservoir just up the road from me, doesn't look like that at the moment. The original raw file is on the left-hand side, the literal processing is on the middle, and the abstract processing is on the right. So you can visualize abstract, you can capture literally, but you can actually process in an abstract way as well. So you've all these options are open to you, providing you've got the dynamic range, providing you've got the data contained with the image. All these options are open to you in post-processing. This one, my original unedited raw file is the one on the left-hand side, rather flat, lifeless looking, and a couple of initial processed examples on the right, on the middle and the right, black and white. Thought I'd try it, but it really didn't work very well. Then the final edited images, which what I've done is comes back to my question: why did I take this picture? I took this picture because of the flow of water and the patterning of the sand flowing through the picture. So my processing emphasized that, and I also decided to, because it matched that kind of muddy, sandy effect, also decided to warm the picture up. So I went for the one on the right-hand side. This one just shows you how, with one original image, there's the original raw file on the top left, the different ways you can process it from very high key to very low key. All these options are available, and it's your personal choice, whichever one you go for. And again, similar style with an isolated ruined church on the Isle of Skye from the original file, high key or low key. One has detail on the sky, one has absolutely nothing, just a feeling of emptiness or space. Right, well, I have reached the end. It's bang on 8 o'clock. Hopefully leave 5 minutes for questions. So, key points. Using your imagination and thinking in abstract terms. Hopefully, I don't need to reinforce that anymore. It's back to my original question: why am I taking this picture? And then using all those compositional ideas you can think of to come up with your final abstract, your image. But try and think in abstract terms rather than thinking, I'm going to a location to take a picture. Try and think about how you can make your own compositions. Thinking of projects or themes, why not go to a place that you know or don't know, any town or any it doesn't matter where you are, and come up. Give yourself a couple of hours and perhaps think of 3 projects and come up with a set of pictures, say 10 pictures, which comply or which meet that particular theme. You might want to make it easy, you might want to make it quite difficult and challenging, but come up with some strong, simple compositions. They will help develop your eye. Hopefully I've shown you enough examples there to see that actually how well easily you can translate that abstract approach from very simple everyday subjects like the rear light cluster of your own car to the kind of photography that you're actually interested in. I've shown you a variety of different styles or types of photography. Think of designing an image rather than taking a picture. That again is fundamental. It's creating an image out of shape and form rather than what you're photographing. And I always say this, right always at the end of my webinars, develop your skills on one of my workshops. There you go. And that picture is always at the end. I never have anywhere to put it. I like that picture, but I can never find it to put it anywhere else to put it on any of my presentations.
Brilliant. Another fantastic hour from you as always, mate, and loads of thanks. Thanks already in the chat box. We've got a few questions, so we will answer them, guys, as promised. They're not in any particular order, bud, but we've got a few in a row here, actually, going back to sort of the wide angle lens questions you had earlier. This one I thought was good, and I'd like to know the answer myself, actually. Do you think for landscape photography you need a fast wide-angle lens, i.e. f2.8, as opposed to an f4? And if you do, what's the benefits of having a fast wide-angle lens for landscape photography?
Rarely need. I've only got an f4. I rarely find that there's any great need for a 2.8. Two fundamental reasons you're going to need a larger aperture. One is bokeh, differential focus. You can achieve that. It's less of a use of a wide-angle lens, but I still use it to defocus backgrounds or foregrounds. Still use it, usually backgrounds. So adding an extra stop would certainly help with that. If you're looking for speed, then, or shutter speed control, very limited. The other main use of benefit of going to 2.8 would be for astro night photography, where every stop kind of counts. So it has a benefit there. Are those two enough to justify the additional expense and size of going to an f2.8? I think not, actually, which is why the camera makers tend to go, on the whole, they tend to prioritize f4 rather than f2.8, because actually the market isn't really there. The other big disadvantage with them as well, they've usually got aspherical front elements, which means that you've got to get a dedicated, very expensive filter system to go on them. Filters are essential to landscape photography, particularly on wide-angle lenses. So for that reason, I generally stick to an f4.
Perfect, brilliant answer, mate. Great. Staying on the wide angle theme, you were talking about this. This came through when you were showing us the section about the panoramics that you were talking about. Obviously, you mentioned about using a very wide angle lens. Also, I presume the question is, so I'll get to the question. This can also, obviously, I presume, be done with standard lens and stitching the images together, or was it?
No, different. No, it can't. Different perspective. You don't get that extension of exaggerated foreground to background perspective with a standard lens than you do with a wide angle. So it will not exaggerate or emphasize the foreground form in the way that the wide angle will do. So no, you cannot do it with a wide angle. With a standard lens.
Perfect. And that, well, that's a good job I asked the question. There we go. Excellent. Okay. I thought this was a good question. When I'm out shooting landscapes, I usually shoot with a particular element, shape, light, or tone in my that appeals to me in my scene, as we were talking about tonight. But somehow I come out with a flat, nondescript image. Any tips on translating my intention? I mean, I think you've touched on that tonight with, obviously looking at that processing section, but anything fundamentally clear to you in that point, in that might be missing?
Without knowing what the questioner means by flat, it's quite difficult to give a definitive answer to that. Do they mean flat in terms of the processing, or do they mean flat in terms of composition and makeup of the image? It's quite a hard one to answer, that, isn't it?
That's fair enough. Yeah.
And hopefully, if it's to do with composition, I've given the questioner enough ideas in that to show how using a style, being very clear on why you're taking the picture, and using the right lens to emphasize that can help. But I say, without knowing precisely what the questioner's issue is, difficult to answer. They'll have to come in a workshop, won't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, yeah, I recommend that, absolutely. But I mean, the key thing is, and I think you've touched on it a lot. I think you've talked about it tonight, and obviously I know we've talked about it in the past on our previous webinars. But obviously, again, there's a massive element of obviously knowing your equipment as well. I mean, you talked heavily about, using the right choice of lens for the image. It isn't just about what you see. It's obviously knowing your kit, isn't it? To actually,
you've got to know the effect. The fundamental, the most important thing is the lens, because it has an effect on the composition in the kind of photography I'm talking about here, because it has an effect on on that relationship between subjects which are near to the camera and subjects which are far to the camera. The subject, whether they stretch perspective and exaggerate it, or whether they compress it and you get that foreshortening effect. So it has a fundamental effect on the composition that you come out with. That's the most important decision to make, technical decision to make.
Absolutely brilliant. This is a good question, but I think, again, I know we've answered this before, so it comes down to kit as well, but I love the way they've put it. When you're out taking a shot, do you ever go, damn, I wish I brought that lens with me? Or are you literally pretty much, as long as I know the answer to this question. Yeah, I know you travel with what you need, but it's a good point. Is that sometimes you can over kit, but I guess from what you
and I have absolutely. I've sometimes thought, oh damn, I wish I bought one lens or another, and ended up cropping a wide picture massively to pick up much more than I should have done because I didn't have a long enough lens with me. Yeah, I've done it.
And again, I
Want to
suppose,
travel, particularly when particularly when you want to haul stuff around. You're going up a mountain. You think, I'll make do.
and I get, that's where the things like the telephotos and that they do get that bit heavier, don't they, and things like that.
Well, they do. Yeah, they do. Yeah, I mean, certainly the previous questioner asked about a 2.8 on a wide, but it is in some ways even more critical, of course, with a tele because the difference, huge difference in lens size between an f4 and an f2.8. So the f2.8s are big. 2.8s are big, and if you're going to be particularly on a full frame, and if you go, well, actually, I don't think many of the crops are a 2.8, but say on a full frame camera, it adds massively to the bulk you're carrying around, particularly if you're climbing up mountains.
Brilliant. Nigel, last question for you. Slightly different, but I like it, and that's why I kept it. When entering images into competitions, they'd like to know your thoughts and feelings over adding borders to the image and line strikes around the images. Not something,
No,
yeah, I know you don't.
no, don't do it. I would never do it.
See, it's weird. I know that you don't do it, and I like that because you don't. I've never seen you do it. But weirdly, we have a chap who enters every week, every month into our photo critiques.
Hmm.
It's got a very definitive style, very
Mm.
black and white, very strong. He's a great photographer. But he
Hmm.
does finish his images. He has a black border and he has a very
Okay.
straight white key line. And I
Okay.
think it does complement his work. But I do ask
Okay.
myself whether because I've this guy enters every month and I've seen an image from him every month, say for about the last 5 years, that I only know
Mm.
it as his style, but I
I'm
don't.
just wondering. Yeah, look, it's difficult for me to comment on
Yeah.
because I've not seen his work. But are you? I'm wondering if his style is being created by the border rather than the imagery,
Well, I think
or is it?
I
And
tell you what.
therefore, are you actually noticing the border rather than the image?
Yeah.
I'm posing the question. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and of course I've put
Mm.
it on the spot because you don't know. No, this guy's a great photographer, Nigel, like yourself, and his images stand out.
Interesting.
But
Mm.
it's quite weird. I'm gonna go and have a look tomorrow at a series of his images, and I'm gonna crop the borders out just to see them. It'll be interesting because I've never looked at
I
it.
wouldn't mind. Yeah, drop me a name. I
Never
wouldn't
done it,
mind
but
having a look. Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, and interesting. But I know that you don't. I know that your images. I've never seen it on your images. So again, it's a
No,
personal
I don't do
personal thing.
it. Mm.
There are definitely, within when we teach it within the portraiture and within the photo critiques, we see borders and key lines a lot, and there are sometimes used completely wrongly. As there is a right and a wrong way to use them.
Mm.
But I
Mm.
think it is an individual. I must admit, and only speaking, and I'm not a judge by any standards. I've just been around photography for a long, long time. But while being at some of the print competitions and the panel viewings over the last few years, I don't see exactly what you said, Nigel. I don't see many panels going through with borders and key lines, to be honest.
Mm.
There are some.
Mm.
I'm not saying there aren't, but and I know for a fact that Dominic, who I'm referring to, definitely does, and he is. He is. I believe he's a fellow. I can't remember what he is.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, fair enough. Mm.
but no, it's a good question. But obviously, I wasn't sure. That's why I asked it because I wanted to know your take actually. Because I don't think I've ever seen a border or a key line on anything that you've done. But it was an interesting
Nope.
question. Um, okay, how do we? I don't know. There's a question here. I'm not particularly sure what it's being asked about. How about watermarks? Well, if you're just referring to protecting your images, that's a different question. There, I don't.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, no, I do, I mean, this is my presentation. It's my, I don't bother. I'm not going to put it. If you get rid, if I put a watermark on all these images in this presentation, it would grate. For my presentation work, I certainly don't put watermarks on. If I'm putting them on the internet, yeah, I do.
Yeah, fair, brilliant, great. I think we're there. Oh, well, before I forget, well, there's something else I want to talk to you about quickly. But a few people have asked about the previous session, and I have replied to them in the chat panel. But guys, if you didn't see it, it's on the Photographer Academy. So, and that goes for also a load of film that Nigel's made for us on landscape photography, as well as all his previous webinars. So, if you're not a member of the Photographer Academy already, if you drop me a line via support, then I can happily arrange for some very
Yeah, and for anyone who does go into it, apologies in advance for the The confusion right at the beginning if I couldn't find the screen.
You don't need to apologise for it. Using the master of editory, it doesn't exist badly on the recording.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Okay.
On the recording, you're perfect.
Right.
No, but there's
Good.
loads of content there from Nigel. So if anybody isn't a member of the Photographer Academy, if you drop me a line via the support email address, then I will arrange for some simple, basic, free access, so you can go and have a look around and see the previous content from us there as well. So I think I've got everything right. Now, we talked briefly last week. Obviously, we're going to have a break now for Christmas, but we did talk about, because we talked a lot about the long exposures last week, and we were going to revisit that one, weren't we, in the new year? Are you still up for that, mate?
Yeah, you can redo that one. It's fine. Yeah.
So we'll chat soon about getting a new date in the diary for that early in the new year. But we do have a bit of a break for Christmas. So, but Nigel, from me to you again, thank you for tonight. Loads of thanks coming through the chat panel. So always appreciated and love having you on.